What if I told you the cozy comforts of your modern life, your foam mattress, your morning coffee, even your socks, would make you the envy of an entire medieval village? Today, we'll step into a time where a dirt floor wasn't an accident, but the norm, and breakfast could simmer for weeks. Trust me, you're not ready for what's coming next. Imagine waking up to the smell of stale hay and something earthy. Your neck aches from the lumpy pile of straw you've been calling a mattress, and as you sit up, a tiny beetle scuttles out from under your blanket. The walls around you are crude wooden planks, loosely fitted so beams of sunlight and the occasional gust of cold air slip right through. Outside, the dull clang of a bell echoes. This is your alarm clock, signalling that it's time to get up and face another day in a medieval village. Let's start with where you're waking up. Your home, such as it is. A modest structure, if you can call it that. A single room that feels more like a glorified shed where humans and animals both live and sleep together. Privacy? Forget about it. You're probably sharing this cramped space with several family members and maybe a goat or a pig if you're lucky enough to own one. Why the livestock indoors? Well, it's not for companionship. Those animals are your livelihood, so keeping them nearby ensures they don't wander off or get stolen during the night. Plus, they provide a little extra body heat in the winter, which is useful since insulation isn't really a thing. Those gaps in the walls aren't purely for ambience. Beneath your feet is a packed dirt floor, sprinkled with straw to keep the dust down. Barefoot? Hopefully not. Shoes might be a bit primitive and uncomfortable, but they're necessary if you'd prefer to avoid stepping on something sharp, squishy, or worse. Remember, with livestock roaming about, the floor isn't exactly spotless. The smell is, well, let's call it distinct. A mix of damp earth, animal scents, and the kind of dankness that just clings to everything. Your bed may technically be yours, but it's far from an oasis of comfort. Stuffed with straw and covered with a coarse woolen blanket, if you're lucky, this is where you've been lying all night. Sounds rustic, right? Add in the occasional crawling insect that likes to make itself at home in your bedding, and you can see why sleep wasn't exactly restorative back in the Middle Ages. Speaking of insects, they're just a part of life. Fleas, bedbugs, and lice couldn't care less whether you've had a stressful day. They're here, they're hungry, and they're part of the scenery. Whatever itch you woke up with, it's not paranoia, it's probably real. Now, let's talk about the sounds and smells that flood your senses as you shake the sleep off. Modern life might offer fresh coffee, percolating in the morning, or the hum of an alarm clock, but here in the medieval village, there's none of that. Instead, you wake to the aroma of damp straw, stale sweat, and the occasional pungent whiff wafting over from the livestock's corner. Flies buzz lazily around the room, landing on just about anything they can stick to. The air is heavy, especially if the weather's been humid. And then there's the village bell. It's loud, it's sudden, and it doesn't care if you are in the middle of a particularly interesting dream. Its purpose isn't just to wake you, it's a signal for the entire community. Time to get to work. For a peasant, mornings are less about lounging in bed or hitting snooze, and more about sheer survival. You have tasks to do, and the sooner you start, the better chance you have of getting through them all before sundown. It's probably no surprise that medieval life was physically demanding. The moment you step out of your bed, the reality hits you. Aching joints, sore muscles, and a general stiffness that feels like you've aged 30 years overnight. For many peasants, that wasn't too far from the truth. Research suggests the heavy physical labour and lack of proper nutrition meant that by their early 20s, many villagers were already dealing with the wear and tear of someone much older. Arthritis, back pain, and other physical ailments weren't reserved for the elderly. They were practically rites of passage. And yet, despite these grueling wake-ups, people got up every day and kept going. Why? Because they had to. Life in a medieval village meant every single person had a role to play. Whether you were tending the animals, gathering firewood, or getting ready to work the fields, your effort contributed to the survival of the entire community. There was no room for laziness or self-pity. You didn't have a choice, but surprisingly, most people didn't need one. They just got on with it. The hardships that came with waking up in these conditions were offset, at least in part, by the deep sense of connection to the world around you. Villagers didn't view their day's labour as isolated drudgery. Instead, it was woven into the rhythm of life, guided by the seasons and tied to the well-being of their neighbours. If everyone worked, everyone survived. Or at least, that was the hope. Even the dreaded morning bell wasn't entirely loathed. Sure, it yanked you out of sleep, but it also meant you were part of something larger, a community. The sound was a reminder of shared responsibility, of neighbours waking up alongside you to do their share. No one survived alone in a medieval village, and that collective spirit pushed many to face mornings with a surprising resilience. And just like that, the day begins. There's no lingering in bed, no scrolling through a phone, no cozying up with a warm drink while the sunlight streams in. Here, the morning is harsh and immediate. The tasks waiting for you are too pressing, too vital to put off. But hey, at least you've made it this far. The next challenge? Breakfast. If you're imagining something hot, hearty and delicious, think again, because your first meal might make you miss the bugs in your straw mattress. Forget about eggs and toast. Your breakfast in a medieval village is a bowl of something called pottage, a thick greyish stew that's as ancient as the dirt floor you woke up on. It's been bubbling away in a pot over the fire for days, possibly longer, and isn't so much cooked as it is endlessly reheated and added to. If that sounds unappealing, just wait. There's more. The recipe for pottage isn't written down because honestly it barely qualifies as a recipe. It's a mishmash of whatever you have on hand. Root vegetables, grains, maybe a few beans if the season's right. Sometimes a handful of herbs gets thrown in, if you're lucky enough to have access to a garden. Welcome to the medieval diet, where variety isn't on the menu and survival is the only priority. The stew thickens as it cooks, taking on a texture somewhere between soup and porridge. Oh, and don't think about asking what's in it, because depending on how desperate times are, it might include acorns, nettles, anything vaguely edible scavenged from the surrounding woods. In leaner seasons, harsher fillers like sawdust or ground up bark could find their way into the pot too. How's your appetite holding up? Bread is another staple you'll see on the breakfast table, but let's not kid ourselves. It's hardly the fluffy loaf you're picturing. This bread is dense, coarse, and often stale. Made from rye or barley flour is functional, not enjoyable. And during the rougher harvests, even the bread wasn't safe from strange additions. Peasants would stretch their limited flour supply by mixing in whatever they could. That might mean crushed acorns, dried peas, or, brace yourself, clay. Yes, clay. Imagine eating something that's basically half food, half dirt. Turns out there's a reason we have the phrase breaking bread. You practically needed to, considering the rock-like texture of some loaves. Speaking of food safety, there isn't any. No refrigerators, no preservatives, nothing remotely close to keeping food fresh for long. Meat, if you could even afford it, might hang in the open air for days before being cooked. It attracted flies, rats, and whatever else had a nose for decaying flesh. For peasants, though, meat was a rare luxury, not an everyday affair. Even storing fruits and vegetables had its own challenges, and without modern techniques, spoilage was almost guaranteed. What you ate wasn't just monotonous, it was often questionable. And what's washing this hearty breakfast down? Not orange juice, not coffee. Your beverage of choice is ale. Weak ale, to be specific. Even children drank it because the water wasn't safe. Most water sources were contaminated by human and animal waste, so the brewing process, which involved boiling, was the safest option available. Think of it as medieval filtration, except instead of crisp, cool water, you're drinking a lightly fermented beverage first thing in the morning. It sounds strange, but this wasn't about getting tipsy. Weak ale wasn't particularly strong, just strong enough to be less of a health risk than the water flowing through ditches and streams. In that way, it was a lifesaver. Still, the medieval breakfast wasn't purely depressing. While it was far from gourmet, there was a sense of familiarity in these meals. A bowl of pottage in the morning wasn't just food. It was a piece of the shared struggle everyone in the village experienced. Families would gather around the hearth, sharing that plain, warm stew and starting their day together. Meals, however humble, were often communal. Neighbours might come by with a small offering, a handful of beans, maybe a few wild onions, and that small addition could liven up an otherwise dreary meal. Food wasn't just sustenance, it symbolised the interconnectedness of survival. Even the monotony of pottage had its moments of change. Ingredients shifted with the seasons, so while spring might bring some green leeks or carrots into the mix, winter meant you were down to dried grains and root vegetables that could survive storage. It wasn't exciting eating, but people made the best of it. Sometimes, a scrap of pork fat might give the meal a richer flavour, or a rare find like a few wild mushrooms could bring some novelty. On festival days or special occasions, villagers sometimes spiced up their pottage with rare ingredients or freshly slaughtered meat, though these moments were few and far between. But if you think about it, the most remarkable part of this entire meal is what it represents, a relentless determination to keep going, no matter how limited the resources. We often picture medieval life as grim and defeating, but food had a way of binding families and communities together. The shared experience of surviving on so little created a bond that went far beyond simply eating. It was practical, yes, but it was also symbolic, a small daily act of survival together. And really, what choice did medieval peasants have between the constant labour demanded of them and the unpredictable nature of their environment? Even eating felt like a gamble some days. Yet there they were, slurping pottage out of wooden bowls, swigging weak ale, and somehow making it through. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough, or it had to be. Breakfast is over, the pot is left simmering for tomorrow, and it's time to face the day. If you thought waking up in a straw bed was tough, just wait. Now it's time to step into your commute, which involves trudging out to the muddy fields, with nothing but a wooden hoe and a long list of back-breaking chores waiting for you. Modern work days? Yeah, they're not even in the same universe. Let's get to it. Your day starts early, too early, and there's no time to waste. The fields are waiting, and you can already feel the damp ground rising through your thin, weathered shoes. Or maybe you're barefoot, if those shoes finally gave out last winter. Either way, your commute isn't a leisurely walk. It's a trudge through muddy paths or stiff frozen dirt. And your only tools? A wooden hoe, a sickle with a blade that's more rust than steel, and your own hands. You're not heading out to chase dreams or climb a career ladder. Your job description is simple: survive. The work itself depends on the season, but hard is a year-round constant. During planting season, the main task is ploughing fields. Don't picture shiny machinery humming along in neat rows. Here, it's you, your primitive tools, and maybe an ox pulling a wooden plough, if your family can afford one. Otherwise, it's just you, breaking the soil one agonising row at a time. After that comes sowing seeds, done carefully and quietly because every grain matters. Each seed that doesn't take root is food loss for you, your family, or your lord. Tending the crops is no picnic either. Endless weeds fight for space, trying to choke out what few vegetables or grains you've managed to grow. It's your job to stop them by hand. There's no stepping back to admire your work, or imagining how good it will look when it's done. You'll be back tomorrow to repeat the same battle against weeds, and it's a battle you'll never fully win. Between all of this, you're also responsible for taking care of livestock. That means feeding pigs, milking cows, or chasing down a stray chicken that clearly has no sense of teamwork. Sundays are your day off, though calling it that might be generous. Sure, it's a rest from ploughing and planting, but Sundays come with their own obligations. You've got to attend church, if only to avoid trouble with the village priest or your lord. There's praying, repentance, and probably a healthy dose of being reminded how sinful you are. And if the crops are on the verge of ruin, or a storm tore through during the week, you might find yourself out in the fields anyway, scrambling to salvage what you can, Sunday or not. In fact, 6-day work weeks were standard, but the days weren't a neat 8 hours long. They were as long as the sunlight lasted. From sunrise to sunset, you're grinding away. Your back hurts, your knees ache, and let's not even start on your hands, which are rough with calluses and cuts from handling tools all day. but no one's handing out praise or bonuses for your effort. Your reward is knowing there might be enough food in the storehouse to last the winter. The feudal system you live under doesn't exactly do you any favours. You don't own the land you're working so hard to tend. It belongs to a lord who probably doesn't even live in the village. Most of what you harvest doesn't even stay with your family. It's taken as payment or taxes to satisfy the demands of the lord and the church. You keep just enough to feed yourself and maybe save a pitiful handful of coins for emergencies. The rest? Gone. You, along with most villagers, accept this reality because the alternative is worse. The Lord's protection offers some shelter from raiders, bandits, or neighbouring lords who'd gladly loot the entire village given the chance. Of course, protection has limits. If the wheat fails or disease sweeps through, there aren't many safety nets. Instead, most of what you endure is a high-stakes balancing act. The threat of injury lingers over every task. Simple cuts can fester without treatment, turning what should be minor into something fatal. A broken bone from falling in the fields, or worse, under a panicked ox, isn't the kind of injury you can afford to rest and recover from. You work through the pain or risk losing everything. And yet, for all the hardship, there are moments of teamwork and connection that brighten the gloom. A good harvest can feel like winning a battle. Everyone pitches in during the busiest times, neighbours helping each other bring in the grain or sharing tools to speed up work. When the fields are full and the barns are stocked, the whole village knows they're going to make it through another winter. There's real pride in those moments, even if they're rare, and somehow people found ways to bring a flicker of joy into the grind. Music drifted into the fields sometimes, flutes, fiddles, or voices carrying a simple rhythm while people worked. Children ran around, laughing, playing little games between tasks, and the communal aspect of labour meant you were rarely alone out there. That sense of camaraderie is vital, because without it, the sheer monotony of the job would crush anyone. The villagers shared more than just physical work. They shared stories while they hauled water or trudged through muddy fields. They passed down lessons, gossip, and advice to get through the day. It's hard, impossibly hard, but life has a way of carving out small moments of connection to remind everyone they're not alone in this endless race for survival. At the end of each exhausting day, you limp your way back to the modest hut you call home. Every part of your body aches, and the fire you manage to light in the hearth sputters weakly, barely banishing the cold settling in for the night. But still, there's a tiny flicker of accomplishment smouldering under all that weariness. You worked, you endured, and tomorrow you'll do it all over again. But before you can settle in for the night, or even think about relaxing, there's another obstacle lurking. Staying clean. Hygiene might not be the first thing on your mind after a day in the mud, but in the Middle Ages, it's a battle as constant as the work itself. If you think your tools were primitive, wait until you find out how they kept or didn't keep themselves clean. It's a whole different challenge, and spoiler alert, you'll never look at modern plumbing the same way again. Imagine this. No soap, no toothbrush, and a toilet that's, well, a hole in the ground if you're lucky. Welcome to hygiene in the Middle Ages, where staying clean wasn't just a challenge, it was often considered unnecessary. From the moment you step outside, your senses are assaulted. The air just lingers, thick with the smell of refuse, animal droppings, and sour, unwashed bodies. Open sewers snake through the village streets, a fetid mix of human waste and whatever liquid runoff. People decided to toss out. And in case you thought things might get better inside, they don't. The huts may offer some protection from the weather, but they certainly don't protect you from the filth. Let's start with bathing, or rather the lack of it. Water in medieval villages wasn't just unsafe to drink, it wasn't safe for much of anything. Collecting clean water for a bath was a hassle, especially since most water sources were contaminated with who knows what. Boiling water was time-consuming and wouldn't be wasted on something as frivolous as hygiene, when it could be used to cook or brew weak ale, the safer and more practical option. If you wanted to bathe properly, you might visit a communal bathhouse, if your village even had one, but those weren't exactly clean either. Bathhouses were also associated with more than just washing, let's say. Gossip, scandals, and other activities labelled immoral by the church often took place there. Unsurprisingly, many were shut down over time, leaving peasants with little choice but to forego baths altogether. If you're wondering what medieval villagers thought about all this, chances are they weren't as disgusted as you are right now. There was a widespread belief that washing too often could open the pores and let disease in. That's right, clean skin was seen as dangerous. Many people didn't even attempt to scrub themselves unless it was a special occasion or festival, and when they did try to clean up, it was more about masking odours than anything else. The closest thing to deodorant, herbal remedies, sometimes mint or lavender wrapped in cloth, stuffed under armpits or carried in pockets to cover up the stench. It worked marginally well at best. Otherwise, you were left to embrace the natural scent of medieval life. Personal hygiene wasn't much better. Toothbrushes didn't exist, and dental hygiene was a complete afterthought. Instead, people might rub crushed herbs or charcoal on their teeth to ward off bad breath. Actual dental care, forget it. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your teeth would likely look and feel like they were auditioning for a haunted crypt. Cavities and gum disease were everywhere, and the only treatment for a bad tooth was to yank it out, often with primitive tools and no anaesthetic. The village barber surgeon handled this sort of thing, between haircuts and bloodletting, of course. It wasn't precise, but at least it solved the problem, if you didn't mind a less than sterile experience. But the real trouble wasn't visible, it was what you couldn't see. Parasites were everywhere. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs infested both people and their homes. These pests weren't picky. Everyone dealt with this constant annoyance, including the nobility. The itching was maddening, the discomfort constant, and you couldn't exactly head to the nearest general store for remedies. The creatures thrived in straw mattresses, coarse clothing, and thatched roofs, making them nearly impossible to avoid. Worse, these weren't just nuisances, they were couriers of disease. Fleas in particular were infamous for spreading the plague. You'd think everyone would have worked harder to get rid of them, but without modern pesticides, or even an understanding of germs, people just learned to live with it. When nature called, things got even messier. Most peasants relieved themselves in a wooden bucket, or a simple hole dug behind their house. And waste disposal was an informal affair. After using the facilities, if you can even call them that, the contents of that bucket were often tossed directly into the street. People might yell, "Gardy loo," as a warning before tossing, but I wouldn't count on it. This wasn't the case everywhere. Urban areas sometimes had public latrines, though they weren't exactly pleasant. Think limited privacy, smells you'd remember for days, and flies, a lot of flies. For the wealthier, castles weren't much better. Sure, there were garderobes, which were essentially vertical chutes dropping waste into the moat or a pit below, but even those were flawed. These waste chutes could work in reverse, with rats climbing up the walls, or in rare cases, enemy forces finding disgusting but effective ways to infiltrate castles. So yes, medieval toileting wasn't just bad, it was occasionally dangerous, with so much human waste everywhere, combined with animal droppings in the streets. It was no wonder diseases spread like wildfire. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever weren't just risks, they were constants. In fact, nearly half of all children in medieval villages died before reaching their 5th birthday. Those who survived grew up in a world where life expectancy hovered between 30 to 40 years, and the causes of death often traced back to unsanitary conditions. Parasites, contaminated water, and exposure to open sewers created a perfect storm for illness. No one really escaped the risk. It was simply the price of living in such an environment. But it wasn't all hopeless. Despite the impossibly low standards of hygiene, medieval villagers had moments of ingenuity. Herbal remedies played a significant role in combating the persistent odours and pests of daily life. Things like sage, rosemary, and lavender weren't just used for cooking. They were dried and hung in homes, or sewn into clothing to keep bugs and bad smells at bay. And while bathhouses had their reputations, they did sometimes offer a rare opportunity to soak in warm water. Rainwater barrels set outside homes might serve as a kind of makeshift washing station if no one else was looking. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was less of a routine and more of an ongoing struggle. a losing battle fought with limited resources and a lot of guesswork. Still, somehow, villagers managed to scrape by using what they had, even if those efforts barely scratched the surface. And just as cleanliness was a challenge, so was braving the weather. Because when you're at the mercy of the elements, your medieval home isn't exactly ready to protect you. Welcome to the next layer of medieval discomfort. Seasons. Whether it's the icy grip of winter or the sticky heat of summer, your medieval home offers little protection from the elements. You're not walking into a cosy, insulated cottage here. Instead, your shelter is a single-room wooden hut, its walls so thin and riddled with gaps that you might as well be sleeping outdoors. These narrow slats of wood let in cold winds, rain, and, honestly, anything else small enough to squeeze through. A chicken could almost find its way in, or out. There's no glass in the windows, of course, just cloth or wood shutters if you're lucky enough to have something covering them. Let's just say you'll feel every season, as if it has a personal vendetta against you. Winters are brutal. First, there's the cold, a constant, bone-deep chill that never really goes away. The fire crackling in the hearth might cheer you up for a minute, but it's not doing much to heat the room. Firewood isn't exactly abundant, and even if you could find a good supply, gathering it might not even be legal. You heard that right. In many areas, forests were owned by lords, and cutting down trees could get you fined or worse, so unless you're feeling brave enough to risk sneaking into the woods with an axe at dawn, you're stuck with scraps, fallen branches, twigs, or maybe some dried animal dung. Yes, you're burning whatever you can find, and even then, the fire doesn't last long. Layering is your best hope for warmth, but don't expect cozy fleece blankets or thermal jackets. Villagers relied on scratchy wool clothing, one damp, itchy tunic layered over another, maybe with an extra piece of linen wrapped around your shoulders if you had one to spare. It wasn't much, and it certainly wasn't enough to block the freezing wind blowing in through every crack in the walls. Meanwhile, your hands feel stiff, your feet are constantly cold and damp, and frostbite. It's not even treated like a real problem, it's just bad luck. You deal with it and hope your toes don't turn black. When night falls and temperatures plunge even lower, you huddle closer to the remnants of the fire, wrapping yourself in whatever bits of worn fabric you can find. Even then, sleep doesn't come easy. The cold sinks into your bones, making you feel more exhausted than rested when morning finally arrives. If winter is a nightmare of freezing winds and frost, summer isn't exactly a picnic either. The temperature inside your hut, which barely felt livable in the winter, now skyrockets. Without fans, cross-ventilation, or any real way to cool off, the heat gets trapped in your home. Your living space turns into what can only be described as a clay oven. And remember, you're not wearing light, breathable fabrics. They hadn't been invented yet. Instead, you're sweating through layers of wool and linen because you can't strip down. Social norms aside, you leave yourself open to sunburn, mosquito bites, and the general grime of medieval life if you start peeling off clothes. Working in the fields under the relentless summer sun is excruciating. There are no sun hats or sunscreen, just the glare of the sun pressing down on you all day. Heat stroke isn't treated medically, it's just called having a bad turn, and you're expected to push through it. At night, when you're hoping for even the slightest breeze, you'll be kept awake by the insistent buzz of mosquitoes and the constant scratching of flea bites. Flies, attracted to the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies, become your constant companions. You swat at them, but it's no use. They always come back. The weather doesn't just torment your body, it's also a constant threat to your survival. Harsh winters can kill crops outright, leaving barns and grain stores empty and starvation looming over the village. In summers, prolonged heat waves can dry out the land, causing crops to wither before they're ready to harvest. Each season feels like it's actively conspiring against you, and when the weather takes a turn for the worse, floods, droughts, freak storms, it's a double disaster. First, there's the immediate ruin it causes. Second, diseases often follow on its heels. Contaminated water from floods brings dysentery. Stagnant air and heat can escalate outbreaks of plague. It's a never-ending cycle, the environment strikes and you pay the price. But here's the surprising thing. Villagers didn't just endure all this. They found ways to adapt, and even sometimes to celebrate. Seasons brought hardships, for sure, but they also marked time and gave people reasons to gather. Winter solstice festivities, for example, turned the darkest days of the year into moments of light and joy, with feasting, music, and a reprieve from work. Summer brought its own communal events, often tied to the rhythms of the harvest. Villagers would gather to celebrate the completion of a particularly brutal planting season, or give thanks for a promising yield of grain. These seasonal gatherings weren't just practical, they were moments of unity, a way to remember that the village was in this together, for better or worse. And through all of this, the snow, the heat, the floods, there was resilience. People made the most of what little they had, layering up in the winter, adapting their work hours in summer to avoid the worst of the midday heat, and leaning on each other when the elements pushed life to its limits. They didn't have modern technology, central heating, or cold drinks, but they had determination. In many ways, their strength and ingenuity turned survival into an art. Yet this resilience raises a question. How did they keep going, not just physically, but emotionally? What gave these villagers the will to push through challenges that make modern life look like a luxury resort? The answer lies in their community, their creativity, and their belief in something greater than themselves. Things we'll explore as we uncover the surprising backbone of medieval survival. It's tempting to see medieval life as one endless grind. The work, the hunger, the dirt. There's no denying it was a hard existence. But what if I told you that medieval villagers weren't just surviving, they were thriving in their own way, as masters of adaptation and community. Despite the hardships, they found ways to carve out meaning, joy, and even a sense of triumph from the unrelenting challenges of daily life. Let's start with how they handled the really big stuff, the endless threats to their survival, food scarcity, disease, bad weather. These weren't surprises, they were certainties. Yet, instead of breaking under the pressure, medieval villagers came together. Survival wasn't an individual effort, it was a collective one. Harvest time, for instance, was a full village affair. You'd see neighbours helping neighbours bring in grain before the rain arrived, mending tools together to get the job done, or pooling labour to plough an extra field. You'd think all this unpaid work would breed resentment, but it rarely did. Why? Because everyone understood the stakes. If one family's crop failed, or their livestock died, the whole community felt it. They weren't just helping, they were protecting their own future. But work wasn't just drudgery. Maybe that's hard to imagine when most of your day is spent sweating in the fields. But medieval villagers found ways to bring life into their labour. Music was a big one. Simple flutes, fiddles, or rhythmic songs helped set a pace for workers in the field. That steady beat made the hours go by faster and lightened the mood, even when the work itself was backbreaking. Storytelling played its part too. At the hearth in the evenings, families and friends would share legends, family histories, or just a laugh at a particularly bad day. These moments weren't just entertainment, they were methods of coping, bonding, and carrying the culture forward, even when every day felt like an uphill battle. Faith, of course, was massive. Religion wasn't just something you participated in on Sundays, it was woven into the fabric of the everyday. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just part of life, it is life. The church gave villagers a way to make sense of their suffering. If you toiled endlessly in the fields, the promise of heavenly reward gave you reason to keep going. On top of that, religion brought people together. Festivals tied to the church calendar were some of the only breaks in the constant cycle of work. These weren't just quiet sermons either. Imagine markets popping up, games being played, and music and dancing stretching into the evening. Sure, it was all under the watchful eye of the priest, but these festivals were welcome distractions. The rare moments when life felt bigger than hunger or exhaustion. And let's talk about those festivals for a moment. They weren't just for the sake of celebration, they were a way to strengthen the social fabric of the village. Take a harvest festival, for example. After the fields were cleared and the grain stored safely away, the village might come together to celebrate. Families would bring what little they could spare, maybe some bread, dried meats, or ale, and everyone would share. There might be music, dancing, and competitions, like tug-of-war, or races, that brought a little levity. These gatherings reminded villagers that even in lean times, they had something to hold on to, each other. That shared sense of accomplishment made the bitter winters or dry summers a little easier to face. They also found clever ways to get the most from their environment. Farming might not have had the perks of modern equipment, but it wasn't as simple as tossing seeds into the ground and praying. Peasants adapted their techniques to maximize yield. One method involved rotating crops across fields to avoid exhausting the soil, a practical and surprisingly effective way to keep land fertile. Livestock played a role too, with manure being used as fertilizer. Innovations like this weren't just lucky guesses. They were the results of knowledge passed down through generations. Each villager not only carried their own experience, but also the wisdom of those who came before them, creating a shared understanding of when to plant, what to plant, and how to adapt when things went wrong. But ingenuity didn't stop at farming. When times were tough, and they almost always were, villagers had an incredible ability to make do with whatever resources were available. Straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if they're feeling especially indulgent, a scrap of wool could serve as toilet paper. Old tools were mended and reused, clothing patched until there was almost nothing left to patch. They found ways to repurpose nearly everything. The limits of their resources forced them into creativity, and this resourcefulness became second nature. The connections between people were just as vital as their resourcefulness. The harsh realities of medieval life created a culture of empathy and mutual support. Neighbours pitched in unasked during emergencies, whether that meant repairing a roof after a storm or helping raise livestock after a sickness swept through. There was no room for being self-serving or holding grudges for too long. Life demanded cooperation, and that cooperation often extended even beyond immediate survival. If someone couldn't pay a debt in cash, they'd barter their skills, trade in labour for food or clothing. It created an intricate web of interdependence, where everyone had something to offer, no matter how small it seemed. At the centre of all this collaboration and careful attention to survival was an unshakable belief that the human spirit could endure anything. The proof of this is the way art, faith, and joy still manage to flourish amid hardship. Think about it. These villages produce songs, stories, dances, and traditions that we still talk about today. The very fact that these communities continued to grow, that they even had enough hope for the future to pass on skills and stories to their children, shows how much strength they had in the face of staggering difficulty. In many ways, their resilience mirrors echoes of modern crises. Facing an uncertain food supply, they worked together, feeling isolated. They turned to storytelling, festivals, or even plain old hard work as an emotional anchor. It's a reminder that while our luxuries have changed, the solutions to hardship haven't. Community, resourcefulness, and a shared sense of purpose are timeless. Medieval life often gets reduced to suffering, but the villagers who lived it weren't just passive victims of their environment. They adapted, they relied on each other, and they found meaning in struggle. Their spirit of resilience shaped the world they left behind, and it's still shaping the way we view perseverance today. But even as we admire their grit, it begs an important question. How does this all change the way we think about our own lives? Let's pull it all together. Life in a medieval village was hard, almost unimaginably so. Every moment was a fight, whether it was against hunger, disease, or the elements. Yet through it all, people didn't give in. They adapted, they shared, they sang, laughed, and told stories by the fire. Their resilience and ingenuity weren't just impressive, they were the foundation of everything that came after. So, take a second to look around. Clean water, warm homes, and medicine aren't accidents. They're gifts built on centuries of struggle. Say a quiet thank you to the modern world, and to those who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to.